Today we're going to be talking about encryption for decentralized systems. We'll be starting out with just sort of a broad overview of some standard encryption techniques. We'll be keeping it very high level. I will not be diving into the details of how encryption works or elliptic curves or bilinear maps or any of these things. So don't worry, we're not going to dive into a lot of mathematical details. If you are interested in any of those, please either put in a question in the Q&A or raise your hand at any point in time. But those will be available either in our paper that is hopefully coming out soon. I'll talk about that in a moment. But for now, we'll keep things high level and we'll talk about what techniques exist, some of their benefits, some of their shortcomings, and what will eventually work to is what we're working on in the Crystal Center, which we're calling the sovereignty solution. You'll understand why we call it that in a moment, and how it solves a lot of the problems that you face with encryption in distributed systems and the internet as it's used today. Again, we're not going to dive into details, but we'll at the end wrap all that up. And my goal with this talk is really that afterwards you know what the different techniques are and how you might use them, and then you can look up some of the details of the implementations, or better yet, for almost all of them, including the sovereignty solution, there are libraries available, so you shouldn't have to worry about how a lot of this stuff gets implemented. I will be taking breaks in between each of these to ask for questions, so please do hit the link in the chat for the Q&A and submit your questions that way. And again, I'll be pausing at certain moments to allow for questions. So let's start with standard cryptography, public key encryption, or end-to-end encryption as it's often called. And this has made a lot of buzz in the news and a lot of literature for a few reasons, which we'll discuss now. Basically, the idea is no matter where a message is routed, let's say our actors are Avni and Bao, just to pick different names than the standard Alice and Bob. And we're going to encrypt this from one end to the others. And the idea is that if we use strong enough encryption, nobody en route should be able to read this message. It doesn't matter what this cloud is, what people are able to see this, if this is on servers hosted by Microsoft or Grab or whoever, who cares? They can't read it unless they have Bao's secret key. And there's one key to decrypt and one key to encrypt, and this is standard public key cryptography. So, okay, that's fantastic. And the interesting part is that if you're interested in blockchains, you've probably heard a lot about signatures and digital signature algorithms. They're essentially the same thing in reverse. So now Bao is going to use his secret key to come up with a signature that's going to live on this message, send it back to Avni, and Avni can then verify that, yes, this was actually Bao, and only someone with Bao's secret key could possibly have done this. I'm going to only talk about encryption, but know that in all cases, it's symmetric. Sometimes the signing algorithm is a little bit easier. Sometimes it isn't. But in general, if you have encryption, you have signing. And there's usually a mapping that way. So, okay, so what are some of the benefits here? Essentially, the reason end-to-end encryption is important is that there's zero leakage. There's not a risk of, if there is some compromise somewhere in the system, somewhere along the internet, that the message gets leaked. We're essentially guaranteed by the strength of the cryptography used. Doesn't require any other parties or any other tools, just the encryption is sufficient. And the tools are pretty well understood. We've known how to do end-to-end encryption for many decades now. Depending on how you define it, it's as early as the 70s and as late as the 90s. We kind of know how to do this. So what's the problem here? Why don't we see this everywhere? Why doesn't everybody just have one key that is their identity, and then we just get this used everywhere? We've been promised public key infrastructure for many decades, and it simply has never happened. And there's a couple of them. We're going to talk about what happens on device compromise, which is essentially the most important piece for any distributed system, is what happens when a device gets compromised. Because otherwise, any distributed system, you could just boil down to a single node and you'd be done. And also, how does a provider check for inappropriate content? How can you do any content filtering? We're going to keep that as sort of another nice to have, but not all of our systems are actually going to be able to meet that. And there's actually better ways to do that after the fact, but it's sort of something to keep in mind. There's some nice features to some of the systems along these lines. So let's talk about what happens with end-to-end encryption with multiple devices. So most people, especially in first world countries, tend to have more than one device. You have a phone, a laptop, maybe a tablet. You might have USB key fobs are very common for multi-device security. Some people have multiple phones, multiple laptops. So we all tend to already be distributed systems, just by the nature of the fact that we use multiple devices. So how do we communicate in this case? Well, one simple naive answer was, okay, let's just put the secret key on every device. This way it's available and you're able to do work on any device. Well, that's great, except that if you get a single compromise, the entire system fails. And devices are lost, stolen, rooted, malware on a daily basis. So if we're looking at this from a distributed system perspective, this level of failure is not tolerable. This is a catastrophic failure. Okay, can we do a little bit better? What happens if instead we have a key per device? Okay, we could have some master public key and some master private key that only gets decrypted, or has a password or something associated to it in order to set up subkeys. And that's a common thing that you do, say, with GPG or other things. And then Avni has all of these keys, signs the message, or encrypts the message, or more correctly, encrypts the session key that's used for the actual email or what have you with that, and then sends all three of those to along with the message itself. And now we can decrypt on each device. And okay, if we lose one device, that's slightly less bad, because we could say that we'll simply revoke that key and keep the other two keys, and we should have less damage, but we've still lost all the past messages. We don't have what's called forward secrecy. That's still pretty bad. And until Avni gets the message about the replacement of keys, so if we have a phone that gets lost or compromised and then replaced, but in the meantime, Avni sent a message with that key because she hadn't heard about the changes yet. Well, not only can you not read it on the new phone, but the attacker can read it because they've compromised that key. Okay, this is not great. Multiple devices do not work well with public key, standard public key encryption. So that's sort of the picture we're looking at. And this is what we're going to try and do better than. Before we go further, any questions about the setup? Do we have any questions so far?
Not at the moment.
Okay, yeah. Let's roll on because we've got a lot more to get to. The common setup to deal with these kind of problems is you rely on some trusted third party. So this could be Google, Facebook, Microsoft, whatever server you want. You have some service provider, and instead of encrypting things end to end, we're sort of going to encrypt them in chunks. So Avni's going to set up some secure channel to this trusted service provider and send her message. The trusted service provider holds on to the message and waits for Bao to create a connection. They use some second factor or multi-factor authentication to say, hey, is this really Bao? And then delivers the message. Okay, this is kind of cool. We can do multi-factor authentication. We can also do enforcement of content policies. That's pretty nice. We get backup redundancy, and Bao can use whatever devices. We can log in from anywhere, anytime, and things are great. So we're no longer worried about a phone being compromised. What is a major problem is if that trusted service provider gets compromised. If we have any failure, any breach in the trusted service provider, it is catastrophic. And it's just as bad as having Bao's phone compromised. And it's not always possible to trust a third party. This is why banks will not email you a statement, why a lot of legal documents have to go through separate parties. It's simply because they don't trust your email provider. And you have to figure out some trusted third party for each link. This is a major pain that I go through on a regular basis, because basically every time I have to do business with anybody, I have to set up some new secure email channel to be able to do anything. Wouldn't it be great if we could have all the benefits of a trusted third party, but also have the privacy of end-to-end encryption? That's sort of the gold standard. That's what we would love to have happen here. So let's talk about a few systems that lead us in that direction before we jump into sovereignty. The first is threshold decryption. This originally started with sort of a server perspective, where if you have multiple servers serving clients and they have, say, they're securing user data, and you want to make sure that somebody can't just steal a database of passwords or keys, here we'll look at it from the user perspective, but it's essentially the same concept. In all of these, you can replace users with servers, servers with users, and you can map nodes around, which is kind of fascinating. The idea is that we're going to take the private key and break it into pieces. So here we have 3 key shares. And in order to do anything, we're going to need 2 of them. In general, it's called K out of N. So you need K shares in order to actually decrypt. And the way this works is we send the message to the key shares that we want to participate in this. We get back some share value, and the share value differs based on what the implementation is. It doesn't really matter. It's some blob. And then on the laptop or whatever workstation or server, we can combine those in order to decrypt the original message. And this is great because now somebody compromises, say, a phone or a single server or something, and we go, we don't really care. They've really gained no significant advantage. Okay, this is cool. We've got end-to-end privacy guarantees that's resilient now to the loss of a single node. We have some multi-factor security. If each node uses some other factor for security other than a password, then we automatically get multi-factor security. We can support multiple devices by having each of them talk to whatever the key shares, the nodes are holding the key shares. That's cool. It's really not very convenient, because to do anything, you have to have enough shares on you. And users, if we asked users to do this, they would get tired of the constant reauthorization. I know in certain corporate environments that I've had where I had like a USB security key that I had to touch all the time, it just felt like I was the, what was the little blob that was in The Simpsons that replaced Homer for a while, where it just kept pecking a key. It's really frustrating for a while. And it works well in a server environment where you can say these nodes will always be in communication with each other, and you can have some way to validate that the servers or the nodes are actually correct. It's not so great for users. It also, now we no longer support content checks. That might be okay, it depends on what privacy model you're looking for. So that is threshold decryption. Just in case anybody hasn't seen that, are there any questions so far about threshold decryption or the trusted third party setup?
Not at the moment yet.
All right, let's keep rolling on. Let's talk about identity-based encryption. This is where things start to get a little bit more interesting, things you might not have seen already. And a quick sort of heads up, I'm going to present it in the way that it was originally conceived, but the most interesting applications of identity-based encryption are actually where you spin things around. So don't get locked into the presentation of the concept of why we're doing this as being the only way to do it. And actually, we'll see with sovereignty that our key insight is we kind of flip this whole thing on its head. So identity-based encryption was originally designed to make public key infrastructure a lot easier. So we wanted to say, okay, could we just use somebody's email address as their public key? And the way this works is that you have some private key generator node that publishes public parameters. So there's parameters known to everyone. And that sort of replaces the concept of a public key. So you have a public key that is for everybody, and then you have this identity. So in our example, Avni takes the public parameters, and she only needs to get these once. And notice that the private key generator doesn't know what Avni's doing with the parameters. She gets the parameters at some point in time, and then she works with them in complete privacy afterwards. And she says, okay, I'm sending a message to Bao, so I'll use Bao as the identity and send this message through mail server, the cloud, whatever, it doesn't matter. Bao then gets this message. Notice Bao doesn't have a private key. He's not able to decrypt this message until he authenticates to the private key generator and gets his private key, which he then can use as many times as he wants to for any messages that come in, again, giving them independence from the private key generator. But this is actually a very cool concept because it decouples the encryption from the generation of keys. You no longer have to generate keys, pass them around, and then use them for encryption, decryption. You can encrypt at any point in time using a public set of parameters. And then to decrypt, you need to get or derive a decryption key. That's a really cool concept. And we can actually extend this even further into a hierarchy. So we can break this identity concept into multiple pieces. And you can have, say, enterprises and departments and then users, and then an identity could be 3 pieces or 4 or 5, or maybe there's a user and then for each user we have multiple tasks and so on. And this is really important. An identity here is not necessarily a user. Think of it more like an identifier. It's whatever we want to set it to, it's some string. And the original concept was users, but it doesn't have to be that way. Now, the obvious problem here is that the private key generator is almost as bad as the trusted third party. If there's some compromise here, it's catastrophic. And not only does it compromise Bao, it compromises any other users in our system. So this is pretty bad that way in terms of a distributed system approach. But it's heading in an interesting direction. So our benefits here are that it simplifies our public key infrastructure. Remember, the decoupling of encryption keys from their use is really important. It's a paradigm shift. It sometimes takes a little bit to really wrap your head around why that's so important. And this still allows organizations to enforce content policies because they could derive certain keys in other ways to allow content checks and then throw out the keys or have secondary keys. There's a lot of ways you can do this in a way that allows them to check things. There's some very interesting developments that have happened with IBE along these lines. Obvious problem we just talked about is that you have to trust the PKG, and the PKG, if it's compromised, is catastrophic. And even with this setup, if we're here, if Bao's device is compromised, this is still problematic because this key is lost. And if Bao's key is lost, then any messages that Avni sent can be decrypted by whatever attacker gets that. Okay, so this is interesting, but it's not solving our problems yet. Before we go further, any questions about IBE? Okay, good. I'm hoping that means that I've explained things fairly clearly. I've tried to, again, keep things very high level. Feel free to ask questions about more details as well if you'd like, even if these are fairly clear, but you want more detail about how these are constructed, feel free to throw that in the Q&A as well. So, okay, we can do a little bit better if we add this thresholding idea and the secret key share idea into IBE. So this is, we're going to break the private key generator into distributed key generator nodes. And each of them now are going to have a secret key share. And this is, again, a K out of N setup. What I'm illustrating here is 3 out of 5, but in general, it can be 2 out of 3, 3 out of 17, 5 out of 7, whatever you feel like. It can be configured. Usually you cannot change K after you've done your setup, but often you can change N. So, okay, same as before, Avni gets the public parameters, aka the public key, sets the ID to bow, encrypts your message, and sends it. We're going to add a requirement that you can validate ciphertext without the private key because that makes life a lot easier. And Bao is now, instead of authenticating to one server, he's going to authenticate to 3 out of 5 and get back these shares. What are these shares? It depends on the implementation, but they're just some blob, some value. Then combines those 3 and ends up again with his private decryption key, which you can then use to decrypt this message. Pretty handy, and basically it improves the failure point of the private key generator. Again, if we lose 2 of them, in this case, we really don't care. The compromised servers don't reveal any new information, and you can prove that these secret key shares, when you have less than K of them, you gain absolutely no knowledge. So again, less than K nodes, not a concern. We get sort of inherent multi-factor authentication if the key generation nodes use different methods of authentication. But you still have to run you still have to trust whoever's running the PKG nodes. And if you set up heterogeneous servers, that's probably going to be more expensive, but maybe that's the cost of security. If you do these with homogeneous servers, there's an obvious problem that, you know, if you find some vulnerability in server 2, chances are the hacker can compromise all of them very quickly. So you can't just take the same instance, replicate it 5 times, or you probably won't gain a lot security-wise. All right, so that's sort of what's been done to date. And a lot of the research has been about different implementations. Can we make them more efficient? Can we add new features to them? But they're sort of all heading in these directions. That's a lot of the work that's been done to date. Do we have any questions so far?
Yeah, actually, one of the participants in the chat section has asked a question. So the question is it sort of like a multi-sig SIG?
Sorry, say that again. I didn't catch part of that.
Maybe if James is online, maybe he can unmute himself to ask the question.
Sort of like multi-sig. Yes, I'm familiar with multi-sig. The short answer is yes. This is threshold decryption specifically is the analog, the encryption analog to multi-sig. So yeah, if you imagine the signing case where these are all shares of a key and you're using these to sign messages, that is exactly multi-sig. And multi-sig is a lot easier than threshold decryption. And there's a number of systems that have done that. And there's lots of work on how do you make multi-sig faster, lighter, smaller ciphertext, more transparent, and so on. But yes, multi-sig is the signing analog to threshold decryption. Cool, good question. All right, other questions before we move on to sovereignty?
Not yet.
Cool. All right, this is where we're going to get things even more interesting. So that's basically what's been done to date with just a lot of technical underpinnings. Implementing and designing systems is extremely difficult. As always, never roll your own crypto, use the libraries, unless you're actually doing research in cryptography, which is what I'm doing. But my stuff is going to have to be vetted by a lot of people before it becomes ready to be used more generally, but I'm hoping that it will get there. Sovereignty aims to solve a lot of these problems. So we do not require any trusted third party. Users can receive their messages on any device. We're really aiming at a distributed setup where users have whatever devices they want to. And even if they add a message or add a device after a message is sent, or they want to authorize some device temporarily, they can do that. If devices are compromised, it's not catastrophic. and we get forward and backward secrecy. So we get stronger guarantees than we had before, but also more convenient. We want to make it so that people don't have to reauthorize all of the time. And that might seem contradictory. How in the world could you possibly get multiple device compromise resilience, and yet at the same time, you don't have to reauthorize all the time? And we'll see that it's basically by having a sliding window where we can configure just how much loss we're willing to take for how much convenience. Because obviously you cannot have, well, perfect security never exists, but you can't have absolutely super fine granularity while allowing devices to work independently for long periods of time. That's not really possible. But if we can trade those off, we can find an optimal, which I think will work very well almost all the time. So underneath this is a construction that we have built called TIBKEM. Not a great name, but again, this sort of lives under the hood. It's our approach to identity-based encryption with threshold key generation, but it's a key encapsulation mechanism. And that's just a fancy speak for, we don't encrypt the entire message, we just encrypt a key that gets used for symmetric ciphers, which is actually how public key cryptography is most of the time used. We do have a signing analog built into this that can be used. And again, it's a K of N scheme, it's identity-based, and it's hybrid. And we allow verification of keys in ciphertext, which is really helpful for distributed systems. So you don't need private keys to verify that a message is valid or that a key is valid, so you can detect bad nodes, bad messages, spam, etc. I'm not going to walk through the implementation of TIBKEM here. It's a very long, very detailed, very mathematical thing to go through. Basically, what I did my qualifying exam on. I can, if people are interested, we can do that separately. But more realistically, you see the paper, there's a full security proof in there. I'm hoping to, if I get a chance later, I don't think it'll be in the paper, but maybe as a follow-up, do something with a proof verifier like Coq or something to actually prove this automatically and use a mechanized proof, but all that stuff will come later. So let's dive into our setup. So BAO has multiple devices. BAO has a phone, say some USB key fob, a tablet, and some shared laptop. Doesn't really need a laptop most of the time. He's borrowed a friend's laptop or the lab laptop or even a workstation, a powerful workstation he wants to work on. And that workstation is not really trusted. On the other devices that are his and only his, he has these secret key shares set up exactly the same as the threshold key generation for threshold IBE. So these are each secret key shares. And we're going to call these trust anchors. And we'll see why in a moment. As opposed to calling them PKGs, we find that trust anchors are just a little more user-friendly a term. It's where you anchor your trust. Avni doesn't have to care about trust anchors at all. She has the master public key for BAO, which is again like the public parameters in IBE. And when she encrypts a message, she's going to use the current time to find a time slot. And these are just buckets of time. And these can be configured to be an hour long, a minute long, a day long. It doesn't really matter. We can set up whatever granularity we want to. Let's just say it's an hour for convenience. And she's going to use that as the identity. So now we have an identity-based encryption system that's only used by BAO. It could be set up hierarchically. That's possible. We don't really go through that in the paper, but it's a very, very easy extension. And she's going to encrypt the message and send it to BAO. So he gets it now on this untrusted device that has none of his credentials on it. And just like in the threshold key generation case, he's going to authenticate to these nodes, which will use some way to authenticate, is this actually BAO requesting this from this random other device? So the phone might use, say, facial recognition or a thumbprint scanner or whatever it is that he's got on his phone. USB key fob, again, could use another fingerprint, thumbprint, or just a live finger detection, something to detect, hey, is this actually Bao? This gets onto the workstation, these shares, which are then combined to come up with a decryption key that is specific for this time slot. And we'll get into the significance of that for the moment, but now this workstation is authorized for just the time slot. And that allows Bao to work, let's say the time slot's 1 hour, work for an hour, and then if he wants to continue working, he can authorize again to get the next time slot key as we need to. And if we lose, say, his phone gets completely rooted, and the secret key share, whatever he has on his phone is lost, we don't really care. That's fine. They've gained 1 share of this secret key. It doesn't actually help the attacker do anything. Okay, what happens if they compromise the shared workstation? The shared workstation had some malware on it. You know, Bao was using an internet cafe you really shouldn't have. What happens in this case? Well, in this case, they've gained the key for that time slot and maybe this message in plain text, but that's it. We've successfully limited the damage that they've done to the current time slot. And that's really important. We can further improve the configuration and the configurability by looking at multiple time slots. So let's say this is the default setup. He's got his phone, he sort of trusts his phone with just a couple of slots. So the current time and say the next time slot, just in case he doesn't want to have to roll over every time. Tablet, he goes, yeah, my tablet's pretty secure. It's on me all the time, and it's not even on Wi-Fi all the time. And this random laptop, well, we'll just trust it for a couple of time slots. Oh, wait a second, that laptop now becomes Bao's primary laptop. He's been using it for a few months, and now he's going on a train or a flight or something. Okay, we'll add all the rest of the keys for, say, the rest of the day. And now, even if he doesn't have access to any other trust anchors, he's able to work on that laptop until he's able to be in contact with them again. And we can even set up policies to automatically renew, say, up to some limit, without having to actually ask Bao for authentication. And that further reduces our user annoyance. So this system is very, very flexible. We can configure it such that if a user is very, very worried about like his phone being lost, that it doesn't keep any keys in cache and it'll just go out every time and ask them. Or maybe it only keeps the current time slot. Or this user is a little more relaxed. They're okay with, you know, keeping 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 around. And maybe they trust their laptop, maybe they don't trust their laptop. Maybe they want to switch laptops, so they remove everything from one laptop, move it to another. All of this happens without Avni needing to know anything. None of our senders need to know what's going on. We're configuring things without them knowing. So that's a great set of decoupling. And we can actually go even further and set up different security levels. And this time, Avni gets to choose. So the sender chooses, is this a high security task? Is this a medium security task? Or is this a low security task? So medium security is the time slot encryption we just mentioned. We figure that should be the default. High security becomes threshold decryption. And we do that by using a hash of the message as the identity. And that's a well-known technique in identity-based encryption, that you can come up with threshold decryption just by taking a message hash. And that way, now you have to involve all of your trust anchors, not all of them, K of them, in order to decrypt that message, because chances are you're not going to have the decryption key for that message unless you get some hash collision, which is extremely unlikely. And low security is now you can just offload tasks. Let's say, you know, you have I don't know, Internet of Things smart light bulb or something like that, and to change the color of the light bulb, you just want to make sure that the requester has, the light bulb key or something like that. Okay, pretty straightforward. So if that gets lost, then you get to a key revocation thing and you go, okay, well, in this case, it's low security, so we can deal with a key revocation in that case. And IBE does allow for key revocation. All we do is prepend the identities with some revocation level and we're done. Alrighty. So as we mentioned, we get a number of benefits this way. We can compromise less than K nodes, and the attacker only gets what's stored in the devices. We don't require any third parties, and we get enormous flexibility. You can place limited trust in devices. You can move your trust anchors around any way you want to. You can adjust trade-offs for convenience and security by adjusting your caching and your key granting policies. And all this is in the control of the user. It's not in the control of anybody else. Senders aren't involved. Nobody else is involved. Now, I tried to think of disadvantages to this setup, and this is basically what I came up with. You can't really adjust the value of K right now. I'd love to find a way to do that. That's seeming somewhat difficult right now, but that's the current limitation. The senders do have to choose the right time slot for this to work properly. You kind of always have that problem. Senders have to use the key correctly. The compromises do reveal the keys that are in cache. And that's kind of by design, that we're going to reveal those. We're going to have to be accepting that much damage if somebody compromises a node. So as you're designing a distributed system, you have to think of what is the worst case damage that you're willing to accept. And we still can't really enforce content policies unless we set this up as a hierarchical IBE, which means that the content provider has to be involved in the user's key, which is not a great setup. I personally advocate a different way of doing this, which is more of a signature and reporting method, but that's a topic for another talk. And I'm pretty certain that this could be applied to many other situations. I was really motivated by this example of message passing and trying to decouple a user's key with its usage, such that if I'm using multiple devices, if I lose or have a device compromised, I can continue on with my life. It's not catastrophic. But I'm certain that this could be applied to whether it's server environments or other distributed systems where you want to decouple key generation from key usage. This is a great way to do it. Maybe you want to be looking at signing records in a rolling window. If you have other thoughts for ways this could be used, please do let me know. Are there questions about sovereignty before we move to the summary?
Yes. So one of the questions is, how much of this sovereignty security solution is out in the market already?
There are pieces of this system that are available, but the short answer is that the whole thing is not. We have developed a library that does all of this. We're developing a more usable proof of concept right now. So I've actually implemented it in a way that sort of proves that the cryptography can be done, but not in a way that's really usable by users yet, which is what we're working on right now. But no, I have not seen anything in the market that does everything we're talking about. Yeah.
Okay. So there's another question. So there's no server doing authentication for the sovereignty solution. So is it something like client-side authentication like JWT?
I'm not sure with what JWT does here. It is true that if we go back to our setup, Avni and Bao have to, this is sort of more like end-to-end encryption, where if like Avni has to know Bao's key. So the key sharing and key signing has to be done. That said, one of the things that I really like about this system is that because it's resilient to keys being lost or compromised, I think that this could lead to users having long-term keys. One of the big problems is that users have not had long-term keys, even going back as far as the 90s. I don't know anybody who's had a key for more than like a few years without being lost or compromised. And now you could set up a digital identity as your sovereignty public key, and people could know that and trust it and sign it and have that going forward. And we could set up a proper web of trust. People have been talking about web of trust since the 90s. I think with this kind of a setup, it's now possible. And another part of the reason that I think it's now possible is that you could put shares of your key, say with a cloud provider that authenticates you by, say, calling you or voice print or something like that. And if you use 2 or 3 providers, you could then recover from losing all your devices. And you would still be able to recover at least long enough to distribute a new key. And I think that's enormously powerful for getting long-lived keys, and which are essentially long-lived identities, which is something we have not had today. Great question.
Okay, so there's another question, which is what are the likely scalability challenges for using this in an L1 blockchain? Each node can be one blockchain node.
I don't really see, so the biggest challenge, right, that I could see is the size of the signatures. So I have not looked at how big the signatures are that come out of the system. They're, to my knowledge, fairly small, but there's been a lot of work on making these signatures as small as possible. And moreover, there's actually a bigger problem in terms of if you used this to sign blockchain transactions, that means they're traceable. And that's by design. You want it such that if Bao signs a message, that Avni can prove this was Bao that signed it, which is not typically something you want in a blockchain. And I've actually been thinking about how could we design the next generation of e-commerce. And in that next generation of e-commerce have cryptocurrency style payments while being privacy preserving, but also allow audit trails. And the short answer to that one is that you use a standard multi-signature wallet and use the techniques that are currently being developed for anonymity preserving and privacy preserving transactions on cryptocurrency, like whether it's Bitcoin, Ethereum, Lightning, what have you. But also, when you submit your proof of payment to somebody, you also give them a signature privately that you sign that this was me that sent you that payment. And now that payee, the person receiving your payment, if they're asked by some auditor, hey, who was it who you did business with? You just sold, I don't know, let's say BMW or something, and it was sold in Singapore for $100,000, whatever. And you're required, because it's over some limit, to show an audit trail of, hey, who actually bought this? It's now, they can provide that for an audit trail, but the general public off of the Bitcoin network or anything else is not able to infer who it was who paid. So that's, to my knowledge, the way that would work. It's a little bit more of a hybrid system. And I think that could work out fairly well. I see these two working in parallel, where this is the identity system, and then standard multi-sig wallets and what's already being developed for blockchain is much more it. Or maybe you encrypt the signature from the identity system and place that into the blockchain with some sort of zero knowledge proof, where the blockchain proof is there. And it's easy to prove afterwards that this was the person that bought it, but in a way that doesn't reveal to the rest of the world what the identity of that person was. That's another way you could do that. So another good question. Thank you for that.
Yeah, so there's no other question at the moment. So
Great.
Maybe we can proceed on with the slides.
Sure. So to summarize what we just talked about, we went through a few different techniques. We talked about standard end-to-end encryption with standard public-private key or asymmetric encryption, which is great for giving end-to-end privacy, and it's very simple by today's standards. Obviously, when it was developed, it was not simple, but is really bad at multi-device security and problematic in distributed systems. We talked about a trusted third party, which gives a huge amount of benefits, but only if your provider is perfect, because you've basically just moved the security problem from the user up to a provider. And now all of the users have to trust this provider, or you have to find different providers for each transaction. We talked about threshold decryption, which provides a lot of benefits and might be great in like a server architecture kind of environment, but it requires all nodes to be available all the time and is really inconvenient for a user. We talked about identity-based encryption, and I would strongly recommend considering identity-based encryption for any distributed system that you're looking at. It provides some really interesting properties, and there's a ton of IBE systems out there with different trade-offs and different features to each of them. But again, you have the problem with the PKGs, which may or may not be a problem depending on how you set them up. And again, end device compromises are so problematic. And then sovereignty is we sort of took IBE, spun it on its head, made it user-centric, and decoupled trust anchors, aka key generation, from key usage. And now no single node is trusted for anything more than what it's strictly required to do. So trust anchors have only a single share of the secret key needed for generating keys. And that, again, through the magic of decoupling key generation from usage, each key is tailored to what it gets used for. So you have a key for, say, a time slot, or you have a key for a particular task, or maybe a time slot and a task. And that way you really narrow things down, and device compromises become much, much less problematic. It does require a little bit more setup. There's a little bit more going on, but that's sort of the cost of having this kind of a system. Sovereignty is coming too soon to a security conference near you. We have the paper submitted, it's under review. We're hoping that it will be published this year. As always, these reviews take a long time and there's a lot of back and forth. So may or may not actually happen, but obviously I'm hopeful that it will. And when it does, we'll inform everybody, and it should be in the NUS News. And around the same time, we're hoping to release our source code. Again, our code is more of a proof of concept right now and shows that the cryptography is possible. We are actively developing end user applications that do this, such that it could then be used for any application that requires encryption or signing. And that's, again, coming soon. And at this point, I'll thank you very much for coming to the talk, and I'll be glad to take any last questions there are, or if you are interested, I'll be happy to update people as we make progress.
Okay, so now we have about 2 questions. So one of the questions is, I'm still a bit confused regarding the trust anchors. Does it still work if you have only one device?
So if you have only one device, then it wouldn't really provide you with very much. It would allow you to delegate trust to other devices, but that compromise, that device, like if you say you only had your phone, this would be a very fragile system, because the compromise of this single node would be catastrophic. Possible, but really not recommended. And especially that it should be fairly easy for us eventually to get to like having a USB key fob that could implement the sovereignty interface. So it should be fairly easy to have 2 devices. And the second device could be key fob, could be like a Bluetooth interface, could be any number of things. Another example of a trust anchor that would work really well is you could have a cloud service. So this cloud service, unlike the trusted third party, they only have a key share. And so if they're compromised, It's not that big of a deal. I mean, not great. You don't want to have compromises, but you don't lose a lot if you do. And they would say, call you, or maybe send you a message through a mobile app or something like that, and verify that it was actually you. So there's a number of ways to get multiple devices, and these trust anchors. That's why I don't like calling them devices. I prefer to call it devices whatever you're doing work on. The trust anchors can be many different things. It can be some service that calls you. It can be a USB little thumb drive thing that you touch, or it can be a Bluetooth token that you keep on you. It can be your phone. You can ask family members to act as trust anchors for you if you really trust your family. There's a number of different ways you can do it, and you can move them around. This is the other fascinating part to this. You know, let's say you're 17 and living with your parents, and your parents are one of your trust anchors as a way to make sure that they're monitoring what's going on. And then you turn 18, 19, and they decide that, okay, you're, of age and you can do stuff. So they give you a USB key or something, and you move your trust anchor onto that. So it's extremely flexible that way. Another great question. All right, next question.
Okay, the other question is, what does it mean by time slot encryption? Does it mean that you can only get the keys during a particular time slot?
Yeah, so the time slot encryption is this idea that on encryption, the identity used is for a time slot. So there's something that ties a message, an encrypted ciphertext, to a time slot, to a particular moment in time. And in order to decrypt it, you have to be authorized for that time slot. And there's a few different crypto systems that have used similar concepts. There was one of a forward secure public key encryption system. I think it was Rand Canetti and a few others who wrote that system, which sort of inspired this idea. Yeah, the idea is just in general that you do things based on time slots, such that a compromise at one time slot does not necessarily provide a compromise at other time slots. And sometimes it's in one direction only. So you take a private key and you reduce its functionality such that it can only generate keys for the future, but not the past, which is actually what Rand Canetti and all system did. In our case, it's in both directions. There are others where you just sort of subtract single pieces, and that's a puncturable encryption scheme, which is really cool. But yeah, the time slot just refers to authenticating or authorizing for specific buckets of time. Yeah.
Okay. The next question will be, with the recent crypto.com hack, what do you reckon is the problem behind the hacks?
I saw the headline, but I didn't actually get a chance to dig into how the hack worked. Anybody on this call know what the details were behind the crypto.com hack? Yeah, I guess I take that up offline. If I can stay on the call for a little bit and I can just look up the crypto.com hack and see if I can get enough background on it. In general, I feel that a lot of the problems we face today are that we don't trust users, and rightfully so. Users lose devices and lose passwords and stuff all the time, but we place too much trust in server operators. We move everything up into the cloud and we just assume that server operators are perfect. And time and again, we've been proven that while they may be well-intentioned, there's absolutely, I don't believe server operators or cloud operators or anybody is ill-intentioned, just that it's an impossible task to try and secure services against all attackers. And we need a much more layered approach, and we need to give users more power to encrypt their data and to keep their data secure. And that's sort of what I'm aiming for here.
All right. Then there's another question, which is, what do you think will be the next step insecurity for the crypto industry?
Depends on whether you mean crypto as in cryptography or cryptocurrency. I'm going to assume it's actually cryptocurrency. It's actually what I mentioned in terms of having an identifiable audit trail. And we haven't seen a standard around that as yet. This is actually something I want to get to once sovereignty is a little more figured out. But I really see that as a really big stepping stone where the techniques exist to do this, but they just haven't been widely deployed, and for the reasons that sovereignty is such an interesting topic. But once we have long-lived identities, I really see it that there should be an easy way for you to go to an e-commerce provider or anybody that you're doing business with, and they provide you with say an invoice or something and say, here, this is what you're buying. And just an automated way for you to say, okay, that's great. You want to buy it. And so you take that, sign it, send them payment, and send a signature of the payment to them. And then they have an audit trail to run with that way. And included in that invoice should be what they want from you. Do they want you to identify yourself or not, for example? Because if you're buying, like, I don't know, a bag of chips for $5, not $5. I mean, it's Singapore, but chips are expensive, but not that expensive. You're buying a bag of chips for $1. And, you know, do you really need to provide an audit trail for that? Hopefully not. But if you're buying something for $20,000, anti-money laundering rules require that they say, hey, who are you exactly? And that's just automated, and your device will say, hey, this store is asking you, do you want to buy this, this, and this? They're asking to know your verified name and address, for example. Maybe they want a phone number. Is this okay? And you say yes, and just like that, you hit yes. It sends them the payment, signs the contract, sends it to them, and you're done. You no longer have to worry about, you know, proving your identity and proving your address and proving all of these things. It's done as easily as sending cryptocurrency while maintaining your privacy. The person who you purchased from can know your address. They have to be able to deliver it to you, but nobody else on the internet knows it. And that's even better because when things are that automated, now companies don't have to store all your private data. So, like, if I'm a seller on Lazada or Lazada platform as a whole, and, you know, Lazada has to keep your phone number, your address, you know, everything that you bought, all this stuff. And maybe they could, if they have a business reason for it, but that provides a big attack surface for people to attack, whether it's Lazada or anybody else, in order to try to get private information. And I feel that if that's automated, then they don't have to collect that every time. They can just request it and it gets delivered to them along with your order, you're set. It's easy for you, easier for them, and more secure.
All right, that's a very good answer. Then that's the last question, I think, to wrap up the whole session would be, I think the example on Sovereignty Wallet was a very great one. Do you have some more examples where you think this will be a technology, where you think this will be the technology? Sorry, I think there's some grammar issues in the question. Do you have some more examples on where this technology will also be very applicable?
So I feel that once we have encryption that can be used on this scale, it enables a lot of things. Like you could have cloud storage that is properly secured. You could delegate, for example. Maybe you have a large cloud tree structure, and you could delegate access to portions of it to some service provider by taking your decryption key for something and giving them access to it for them to operate independently. There's a lot of possibilities that way. I think this could enable, say, a distributed social media network where posts and follows and videos and so on are properly encrypted in ways that only the participants can use, also derived from this. So yes, I see many, many applications, and it's just really, we want to sort of get the foundation down, and then we can start to explore all kinds of very cool applications.